Good morning. This morning we are starting our new sermon series titled Jesus 2014. And here's what we're going to be looking at is Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, okay? So that's what we know of him is 2,000 years ago. And what I want to look at in this series is what if he was living today with us? How would he actually respond to the culture that we live in? How would he respond to the people we find ourselves around? And the reason I think this is so important for us to understand is this. Who is our model, the model our lives after? Who? Okay. As believers in Jesus Christ, our model is Jesus Christ. So we kind of need to know how would he react to the world that we find ourselves in so that we can behave the way he did. All right? So that's what we're going to be looking at during this series. And today we're going to look at this topic is this. How would Jesus relate to the people in our society when it is so sexually immoral? Okay, as we live in what would be considered a sexually immoral society, and how would Jesus react to it, living the lives we live? Before we dig into that, let me just define what sexual immorality is if you are not aware of what that is. It is sinful sexual behavior in God's eyes. And the way God would define it throughout the scriptures is this. Any type of sexual activity outside the confines of marriage would be considered sexual immorality, that you are behaving in a way that's immoral in God's eyes, okay? That covers homosexuality, that covers cohabitating, that covers adultery, the whole list that we can make of different sexual behaviors outside the confines of marriage, that would be considered sexual immorality, all right? Now, the Bible teaches very clearly this topic that what God desires is that sex is contained within a committed relationship and marriage of a husband and wife. There's people that try to debate that at this point, but the only way to debate it is they literally have to butcher the scriptures in 15,000 different ways to get there, and it's insanity. Everybody knows what the Bible teaches, which is this: you are to marry your husband or wife, and that's where sex happens. Okay? That's what we see in the Bible. It's not really a debatable thing. But here's the deal. We live in a sexually immoral culture in the United States of America without any doubt. Let me give you some statistics just to kind of show that out to you. 96% of people in the United States have had sex before they're married. Okay? That doesn't mean they've had multiple partners. It could be they got engaged and had sex before their wedding day or whatever else, but 96% of the people in the U.S. have had sex before marriage. If you look strictly at Christians, that number actually goes up to, or drops down to 89%. So 11% of people that grow up in the church actually wait till they're married. But the general public, you're at 4% that actually do. 60% of people today live together before they get married. So in your relationships and marriages from today moving forward, right now, 60% of them have lived together before marriage. 61% of men and 48% of women have reported having an affair at some point while they were married. Okay? And 3% of our population claims to be involved in homosexual behavior. And in our culture, all those things are applauded and encouraged as great. And they're wonderful and no issue. Okay? We live in, biblically, what would be considered a sexually immoral society. There's no debating it. It's the culture we are surrounded by. Now, what you might be surprised by is this. The culture that Jesus found himself in wasn't a whole lot different. There wasn't a drastic difference from the culture we find ourselves in. For instance, in the Jewish communities, there would have been some isolation from most of those things. You're just going to scream behind me. So contained inside the Jewish communities, most of the people there would never have applauded or accepted those things and said those are moral. They would have been around some, but it wouldn't have been prevalent. But understand the Jews at this time, and Jesus' time frame is 33 years, they are ruled by Rome. And they are ruled by the Roman culture as well. And the Roman culture was much more sexually immoral than even the United States culture that we live in today. It would be even more corrupt if you were looking at God's standards than what the United States is. So while Jesus spent a lot of time with the Jews and in Jewish communities where there would have been some isolation, everything surrounding that was a totally pagan society of Rome. Okay? So he would have not been ignorant of any of these issues. These are all things that Jesus would have been very familiar with and ran into all the time in the society back when he lived. That might surprise you, even though it was 2,000 years ago. He would have been able to relate to our culture very easily in the area of sexuality. So the question this morning is this. How would Jesus have dealt with the sexually immoral people that he encountered and that we encounter in our lives today? That's what we're really going to talk about. Thankfully, the scriptures make it pretty clear. We can get a pretty good idea. I don't have to come up here and make a bunch of opinions and thoughts of what I think. You can see from the scriptures. And 3 scriptures that I'm going to use this morning that kind of be the template to walk through this. Here are the 3 scriptures. You can read them this week because I'm not going to give specific phrases a whole lot up on the screen. But in Matthew 9, we have an instance, Jesus eats with a guy named Matthew. Matthew ends up being one of his disciples. At this time, Matthew is a tax collector. And it says he is eating dinner at Matthew's house after trying to recruit him to be one of his disciples. Matthew invites him in, and it says he's eating with a whole bunch of sinners that would have included prostitutes, the corrupt tax collectors, and any other type of immoral person you could have figured and found out in the Roman Empire. He's at a dinner table eating with them, okay? The other one comes from John chapter 4. Jesus runs into a Samaritan woman. A Samaritan woman at that time, Samaritans and Jews didn't mix. Samaritans were seen as second-class citizens. They were seen as half-breeds. They were half Jewish and half something else. They were half-breeds, and they were kind of shunned by the Jews. The one that he interacts with has been married 5 times, been divorced all 5 times, and now she's living with another guy, not married to him. And she's living with another guy. That's the John 4 instance. John 8, Jesus finds himself in an instance where a woman has been caught in the act of adultery. This doesn't mean she's just an adulterer, meaning the guys went in while she was in the act of adultery, yanked her out of the bed, and they pull her into the town square, and Jesus happens to be there, and he gets caught up in the middle of this whole situation, okay? Those are the 3 instances I'm going to reference multiple times today that will give us a good feel of how Jesus would react to a sexually immoral society. So, what do we learn from Jesus? How did he react to these people? 3 very clear things we will see. The first one is this. We see that Jesus had no problem being around them. Jesus had no problem being around them. He didn't avoid them like the plague, like some Christians seem to think is our obligation today. We live in a society where there's the secular society and there's Christian society. And we have a segment of the Christian society that says this: if people are immoral and they're sexually immoral, you avoid them like the plague and you stay out of their circles and you make sure they live there and you live here and you stay separated from them. Jesus does the complete opposite. Jesus goes, I'm going to sit right down with you. In fact, we see time and time again where the religious leaders in Jesus' time are attacking him and going, why is he eating with those sinners? Why is he with those prostitutes? Why is he with the tax collectors? Why is he spending time with them? He should be spending time with us and be with us. We don't intermingle with those people. And he gets attacked time and time again because he's sitting down, eating with them, talking with them, hanging out with them. And the religious leaders go, you should be separated from them. We still are in that culture today. Some religious people go, if they're immoral, what do? Stay away from them, right? Don't intermix. Stay with just Christians. Hang out with your Christian friends. Don't intermix with the society. Paul kind of references this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, a very interesting passage as well. Paul previously somewhere wrote this Corinth church and made a comment that they mistook. And here's what he says in 1 Corinthians, kind of correcting a previous letter he had that we don't know what that letter was. But here's what he writes. Paul says, when I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulged in sexual sin. And he says, but I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sin or who are greedy or cheat people or worship idols. You would have to leave this world to avoid people like that. Okay? So Paul goes, you guys misunderstood me. When I said don't hang out with people who are sexually immoral, I wasn't meaning the people of this world. If you were going to do that, you would have to leave this world. You would have to go to a convent somewhere and isolate yourself and build a little city where it was only you. And he goes, that's not what I was implying. He then goes on and says, what I was implying was Christian brothers and sisters who live those lifestyles and go, it's okay to live that lifestyle, and they're preaching and teaching that to others, you go, those people, Paul's going, you don't eat with, you don't associate with. But the world, you have no problem associating with. You can't leave them. They're around you. You have to interact with them. And Paul's confirming that. So the first thing we see, how would Jesus interact with them? How should we? You should be interacting with them. You don't isolate yourself. You should be around them. You should be in conversations with them. You should know them if they are sexually immoral. Chances are 95% of you in here could consider yourself sexually immoral at some point in your life. Okay? So you're just interacting with yourself. That's what we're saying. You don't isolate yourself from the world. Second thing, how would Jesus interact? We see this. We see he didn't get mad with them. He didn't get mad at them for their behavior like the religious people did. Let me point out some things. In Matthew 9, Jesus is at a dinner table. He's eating with all these prostitutes, tax collectors, stuff like that. Here's what the scriptures say. It says the religious leaders were outside at that time talking to his disciples, and they asked questions like this: why does your teacher eat with such scum? The religious people looked at the sexually immoral and the corrupt and everything and went, they're just scum. They're second class. They're not really humans. Why is your teacher meeting and eating with them? They're mad at him. What's Jesus doing? He's eating dinner with them. Okay, that's what Jesus is doing. We have this one in John 4. You have the Samaritan woman. And it reads this. It says the Samaritan woman's basically shocked that Jesus talks to her. The quote is this: as the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. So he shows up at this well, the Samaritan comes out, and he starts having a conversation, and it says she's kind of taken back at first because she's like, Jews don't talk to us. We're nobodies. They never interact with us, and this guy's talking to me, and she's going, why are you talking to me? So what you see is the Jewish society, the religious people went, second class, we're separated, you don't matter to us, and Jesus went, yeah, you matter to me. You matter to me. Yeah, you've been married 5 times. You're living with a guy right now. That's fine. You still matter to me, and I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to give you value. In John 8, the woman caught in adultery. You had the religious leaders dragging her out of her situation, screaming at her, and they are ready to stone her to death, which is they grab stones and they get a mob around her, and they start chucking stones at her until she's dead. That's what they're in the process of doing. What does Jesus do? If you know the story, Jesus is in a mix of it, and Jesus somehow just diffuses the whole situation to the point that everybody walks away and she's left there with him. So you have everybody else mad at her except Jesus. And Jesus is going, I'll diffuse this whole thing, and I'm going to talk to you. We're going to have a conversation. It's just amazing when you look at it, how much Jesus was different than what we see in the church a lot of times today in America. Is that not true? Jesus was not, one, away from them, and 2, he wasn't mad at them. Now, my question was this: why wasn't he? Why didn't Jesus get mad at them? They were living immoral lives. They were involved in immoral sexual activity in their lives. Why did he not get mad at them? This is my opinion. This is why I think he wasn't. They weren't doing anything that personally affected and harmed him. They weren't. But Jesus knew that they were engaged in activities that were going to hurt themselves. So instead of getting mad at them, what you see from Jesus is time and time again, Jesus shows them compassion. Because I think Jesus looked at these people and went, I'm not mad at you. What you do, if gay people are getting married, if people are having adultery, it's not going to affect my marriage, to be honest with you, okay? The reason I care about those things is I look at those situations and I go, it's going to hurt you. There's consequences of those things. And that's what Jesus saw, was Jesus went, I know these behaviors are going to hurt you, and I don't want to see you get hurt. Now, Jesus knew that because he's the Son of God. We know it because of stats. Let me give you statistics of lifestyles. Number 1, living together before getting married actually increases your chances of divorce by 50%. It doubles it, okay? 75% of children born to couples living together will end up living with only one parent by the age of 15. Last week we talked about, I think it's 43% of children right now in the United States are growing up without both parents at home. You take live-together couples that aren't married, 75% by the age of 15 are without both parents living at home with them. Couples who live together report significant lower levels of closeness, love, and satisfaction and intimacy in their than marriage couples. They also report significantly higher levels of personal stress. When you look at it and you think it through and reading the research on this, one of the reasons they think this is because there's not really a full commitment. So both people in that union or whatever living together are both kind of stressed all the time because they're not really sure if the person's fully committed to them or not, and when someone might just bail out of the thing or not because there's nothing there to hold them together. So it increases stress levels. Here's other things. Homosexual relationships last an average of just 2.4 years. 2.4 years is the average homosexual relationship. Those engaged in homosexual behavior account for 67% of all AIDS cases in the United States of America. 3% of the population, they account for 67% of the AIDS cases in America. 37% of those engaged in same-sex relationships report being abused by their partner. 19% of those engaged in homosexual behavior have tried to kill themselves. That's 6.5 times the national average. 6.5 times higher. 67% of those engaged in lesbian behavior report to having pursued psychological counseling for long-term depression and sadness. And 71% of those engaged in homosexual behavior currently have at least one STD currently right now. Now, you might be going, oh, those are stats you got from Christian websites. These stats come from the New York Times, the RAND Corporation, which is a professional polling place, Dr. Phil, okay? The Archives of General Psychiatry, and the CDC, the National CDC. None of those are conservative-based, Christian-based organizations, and they're giving you those stats on cohabitation and homosexual behavior, on those things. What you see is this. Guys, those aren't the best ways to live your life. Are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. But in general, is that the best way to live your life? Not when you look at the stats. And I believe Jesus Christ knew back in even that day, looking at it, just going, this is not going to serve you well. And I think that's why he wasn't mad, as he looked at me and went, I have compassion for you because I know what this is going to lead to, and I love you. So he didn't get mad, he showed compassion. The third thing we see is this. Jesus was concerned about leading these people to God and then leading them to have a different focus in their life. That was his concern. I want to point you to God, and I want to lead you to having a different focus in your life than the sin that you're currently living in. You might sit here and go, so is Scott saying you avoid the topic? Absolutely not. Jesus doesn't avoid the topic. Listen to these. Matthew 9. He's sitting at the dinner table. Outside, the Pharisees are looking, going, why is he eating with the scum? Jesus is eating dinner with these guys, but he does say this when he hears the guys outside going, why are you eating with these losers and these scumbags? He says this. He says, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. He recognizes there's something not good happening with them. And then he goes on, he says, for I have come to call not those who think they're righteous, pointing out the guys outside, the people who think they're perfect. I haven't come to call those people. I'm not wasting my time with those people. He says this, he says, but those who know they are sinners. So he goes, these people know they're not living the way God wants them to. I'm here to work with these people. That's what I'm about. In the John 4 account, you have the Samaritan woman. He says this after he reveals to her, he says, go get your husband. She's like, well, I don't have a husband. And he's like, I know you don't have a husband. You've had 5 husbands and you're actually currently living with a guy. And she's like, you must be a prophet. How did you know all that? You don't even know who I am. How did you figure that out? And he's like, well, you have 5 rings on your hand. I don't know. But anyways, he says this to her midway through the conversation. He says, indeed, it's here now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And he says the Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. What he says to her is this: you can still worship God, and you can still be made right with God. And God's looking for people that will worship him this way. And he says, I know what you've been doing. I'm not going to focus a whole lot on that. You need to focus on this, living for God, worshiping him with your life. In John 8, you have the woman caught in adultery. There's a couple of accounts. Jesus goes through and he writes something on the ground. He also says to the guys, the one of you that doesn't have sin, you throw the first stone. So the one of you that's perfect, that has no sin for anyone to cast stones at, you be the first one to chuck it at her head. And it says they kind of just all drift off. And at this point, it's left with Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. And when it boils down to it, here's his comments to her. He says, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? And she says, no, Lord. she said. And he says, and Jesus said, neither do I. I don't condemn you either. And he says, go and sin no more. He doesn't tell her, go continue your lifestyle. He just says, hey, go live a different way. This isn't getting you anywhere good. Go live a different way. Go and sin no more. Go live the way God would have you to live. Start your life anew at this point. That's what he relates to. You see, what Jesus did with the sexually immoral is this. He built a relationship with them. He let them know, before I care about your sin, I care about you. Before I'm going to condemn you about your sin, before I'm going to bring up how evil you are and the things you do are wrong, I'm first going to let you know I love you and I care about you. And he let them know that first. After establishing trust with him in that relationship, then he would actually take time and he would talk to them and he would go, hey, you know what? Maybe you need to go a different way in life. And I know that way. I'm the Messiah. Let me lead you a different path. Here's a different direction to go because I care about you, and where you're going is not going to end well. It's going to lead to heartache. It's going to lead to hurt. It's going to lead to physical ailments at some point, and I don't want to see that in your life. Go a different way. That's what we see from Jesus. So to wrap it up this morning, the question is simply this. How should we deal with the sexual immoral culture we find ourselves in? Does everybody here admit we live in a sexually immoral culture? Okay? How do we live in it then? Here's what you're not to do. You are not to ignore them. You are not to get mad at them, and you are not to force them to conform to the lifestyle that you have chosen to live. Understand, Christians, we made a free will choice to obey God and go, we're going to live the way you want us to live. Those that do not know Jesus Christ have not. Just making laws to make people conform to the standards we choose to live by doesn't do any eternal good for them. We're not going to save people through our government. We're going to save people through our individual relationships with people. So we need to get our minds off of, let's put all the laws and have the laws all the way we want. I'm not saying don't fight for some things. I'm not saying you're not supposed to be political. But what I'm saying is, if you think your savior to saving people is our government and putting laws, how well did that work out for the Jewish people? Did it work out well? No, the Jews could never follow the law of God. That's why Jesus had to come. Laws don't save anybody. All laws do is reveal to you need help. That's what laws do. So we are not to ignore them. We're not to get mad at them. And we're not to sit there and go, you need to just live the way I tell you to live because I tell you you're supposed to live that way because I'm better than you. Here's what we see from Jesus. When we run into our sexually immoral world, we need to do this. We need to get to know them, build relationships with them. We need to have compassion for them and understand where they are and look at it and go, I love you and I want something better for your life. And at that point, we are to point them to Jesus and we are to show them that Jesus has a better choice in their life than the sin that they're caught up in right now. But you can't get to that point until they trust you and know that you love them. Folks, as Christians, we are to be the light of the world. We are not to be the condemners running around telling everybody how awful they are. We're to be the people showing them that there's something better and it's found in Jesus Christ. And I will show you that something better in my life first before I tell you you have to be there. That's who we're called to be. That's how we are to react to the sexually immoral world that we find ourselves in, because that's how I think Jesus would. Let's pray.